The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Captain Thomas Hartwell adjusted his ceremonial sword for what he believed would be just another ordinary day. He had served the royal family for 23 years, watching Prince George grow from a curious toddler into the thoughtful young man he had become. Thomas remembered the day he first took his oath, standing proud and determined in his crisp uniform, promising to protect the royal family with his life. Prince George, now 16, had always been different from other royals. While his peers focused on grand ceremonies and public appearances, George spent his time reading about social issues and visiting local communities. Thomas had accompanied him on countless unofficial visits to homeless shelters, children's hospitals, and elderly care homes. The prince never wanted photographers present during these visits. He simply wanted to understand the real struggles of ordinary people. Thomas had noticed changes in the prince over the past few months. George seemed more thoughtful, more distant during their daily walks through the palace gardens. The young royal would often stop to speak with gardeners, kitchen staff, and maintenance workers, asking about their families and lives outside the palace walls. These conversations seemed to weigh heavily on George's mind. The relationship between Thomas and Prince George had evolved beyond the traditional guard and royal dynamic. Thomas had become something of a father figure to the prince, especially after George's parents had grown increasingly busy with state affairs. They would spend hours discussing philosophy, history, and the role of monarchy in modern society. George often questioned whether the enormous wealth and privilege of the royal family was justified when so many people struggled to meet basic needs. During one particularly memorable conversation, Prince George had asked Thomas about his own family. Thomas shared stories about his modest upbringing, how his parents had worked multiple jobs to provide for their children, and how he had joined the royal guard partly for the steady income and benefits. The prince listened intently, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness that Thomas couldn't quite understand at the time. The palace buzzed with preparations for the upcoming charity gala, an annual event that raised funds for various causes. However, Thomas noticed that Prince George seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the lavish preparations. The prince questioned the irony of spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on a single evening to raise money for charity, when that same amount could directly help hundreds of families. Thomas began to realize that something significant was troubling the young prince. George had started making unusual requests, asking for detailed information about the lives of palace staff, their salaries, working conditions, and family situations. He seemed particularly interested in understanding the economic gap between the royal family and those who served them. The captain found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His loyalty to the royal family was absolute, yet he couldn't ignore the genuine concern and moral struggle he witnessed in Prince George. The prince was grappling with questions that had no easy answers, questions about duty, privilege, and social responsibility. As days passed, Thomas noticed that Prince George was giving away personal items to staff members. Small gestures at first, a watch to a gardener whose own had broken, expensive books to tutors, jewelry to housekeeping staff for their daughters. The prince claimed these were simply gifts, but Thomas suspected something deeper was happening. The evening before everything changed, Prince George asked Thomas to join him for a private dinner in his chambers. The conversation was unlike any they had shared before. George spoke passionately about social inequality, about the responsibility that came with privilege, and about his growing conviction that change needed to come from within the royal family itself. Thomas listened as the prince described his vision of a monarchy that truly served the people, not just symbolically but practically. George talked about using royal resources to create meaningful change, about breaking down barriers between the royal family and ordinary citizens, and about leading by example rather than simply maintaining tradition. That night, as Thomas completed his final security rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Prince George had thanked him repeatedly during their dinner, expressing gratitude not just for his protection but for his friendship and guidance over the years. There was something final about the way the prince spoke, as if he was saying goodbye. The captain had served long enough to recognize when something significant was brewing within the palace walls. He had witnessed royal scandals, family disputes, and political pressures, but this felt different. This felt like the quiet before a storm that would change everything he had known and dedicated his life to protecting. As Thomas prepared for bed that night, he reflected on his years of service and the unique relationship he had developed with Prince George. He wondered if he had somehow failed in his duty by encouraging the prince's questions about social responsibility and inequality. Perhaps he should have discouraged such thoughts, redirected the prince's attention to more traditional royal concerns. Little did Thomas know that tomorrow would bring a decision from Prince George that would not only change the course of the young royal's life, but would also force Thomas to confront the most difficult choice of his own career. The foundations of everything he had believed in and fought to protect were about to be shaken to their core. The morning arrived with an unusual quietness in the palace. Thomas woke earlier than usual, feeling an unexplained sense of urgency. As he dressed in his formal uniform, he noticed his hands trembling slightly while fastening the buttons. Something in the air felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't identify. Prince George had requested a private meeting in the palace library at 9 o'clock sharp. Thomas arrived precisely on time to find the prince already there, standing by the large window that overlooked the gardens. George was dressed simply in a plain white shirt and dark trousers, notably absent of any royal insignia or formal attire. The prince turned as Thomas entered, and the captain immediately noticed something different in the young man's eyes. There was a calmness there, a resolution that hadn't been present before. George smiled warmly, but there was sadness mixed with determination in his expression. "Captain Hartwell, thank you for coming," Prince George said, gesturing to a comfortable chair beside the fireplace. "Please sit. We need to have an important conversation." Thomas remained standing as protocol demanded, but Prince George gently insisted. "Thomas, please. Today I need you to sit with me not as my guard, but as my friend." The formality in the prince's voice made Thomas's chest tighten with apprehension. He had heard that tone before, during the most serious moments of royal decision-making. Whatever was about to happen would be significant. Prince George sat across from him, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "I've made a decision that will change everything," he began slowly. "I've thought about this for months, and I know it's the right thing to do, even though it will be difficult for everyone involved." Thomas felt his heart begin to race. In all his years of service, he had never seen the prince look so serious yet so peaceful at the same time. "Your Highness, whatever you're considering, perhaps we should discuss it with your parents first." George shook his head gently. "This is my decision to make, and I've already informed them. They're not pleased, but they understand that I cannot be swayed." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Thomas, I'm renouncing my position in the line of succession. I'm giving up my royal titles and privileges." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He felt the room spin slightly as he processed what he had just heard. "Sir, you can't be serious. This is your birthright, your destiny. The people need you. The people need change, Thomas. They need someone who understands their struggles, who can bridge the gap between the monarchy and ordinary citizens. I cannot do that from within this golden cage." Prince George's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the emotion in his eyes. The prince stood and walked to a desk where several documents lay waiting. "I've spent the last year studying law, working with constitutional experts and understanding exactly what this decision means. I'm not doing this impulsively or out of teenage rebellion. This is a carefully considered choice based on my beliefs about how I can best serve my country." Thomas struggled to find words. His entire identity was built around protecting and serving the royal family. If Prince George was no longer royal, what did that mean for his own purpose and duty? "I know this is difficult for you to understand," George continued, returning to his seat. "You've dedicated your life to protecting me, and now I'm telling you that the person you've sworn to protect is choosing to walk away from everything you've fought to preserve." The captain finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why, Your Highness? You have the power to create change from within the system. You could reform the monarchy while maintaining its strength and stability." Prince George smiled sadly. "I've considered that path, Thomas, but I've come to believe that real change requires real sacrifice. How can I ask the people to trust me to understand their struggles when I live in a palace worth millions, while they worry about paying rent? How can I speak about equality while wearing a crown that represents centuries of inherited privilege?" The prince reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple envelope. "I've written you a letter explaining everything in more detail. But I wanted to tell you personally because you've been more than just my protector. You've been my mentor, my friend, and in many ways, the father figure I needed during the most important years of my development." Thomas felt tears forming in his eyes, something that hadn't happened during his entire career in service. The man he had watched grow from a child into a thoughtful young adult was making a decision that would affect not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who served the royal family. "What will you do?" Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to university like any normal young man. I'll study social work and public policy. I want to learn how to help people from the ground up, not from a throne room. I'll work in community centers, homeless shelters, and social service organizations. I'll earn my place in society through my actions, not my birth." The weight of the decision was overwhelming. Thomas realized that in a few short hours his entire world would be turned upside down. The prince he had sworn to protect with his life was choosing to become an ordinary citizen. "And what about your security?" Thomas asked, his protective instinct still strong despite everything. "I'll have minimal protection for a transition period, but eventually, I want to live like everyone else. I can't truly understand the lives of ordinary people if I'm constantly surrounded by guards and barriers." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window as he tried to process everything. The gardens below looked the same as they had yesterday, but everything felt completely different. The world he had known and served faithfully for over 2 decades was crumbling around him. Prince George approached him quietly. "Thomas, I need you to know that this decision isn't a rejection of you or your service. You've shaped who I am today. Your stories about your own family, your integrity, your dedication to doing what's right even when it's difficult, all of that influenced my thinking about what kind of person I want to be." The captain turned to face the prince, seeing in that moment not the royal he had sworn to protect, but the young man he had helped raise and guide. The decision was made, and nothing Thomas could say would change it. All that remained was to figure out how to move forward in a world that would never be the same. The news of Prince George's decision spread through the palace like wildfire. Within hours, every staff member, from the head butler to the youngest kitchen assistant, knew that their world was about to change forever. Thomas watched as shocked faces appeared around every corner. Whispered conversations filled the hallways, and an atmosphere of uncertainty settled over the entire royal residence. Thomas found himself in an impossible position. Protocol demanded that he report to his superiors about any threats to royal security. But how could he classify Prince George's personal decision as a threat? The prince was not in danger from external forces. He was making a conscious choice that happened to endanger the very institution Thomas had sworn to protect. The royal family called an emergency meeting that afternoon. Thomas was summoned to provide his assessment of the situation and his recommendations for moving forward. As he walked through the familiar corridors toward the meeting room, he felt like a man walking to his own execution. The king and queen sat at the head of a long mahogany table, their faces showing the strain of the morning's revelations. Other senior family members were present, along with key advisors, constitutional experts, and security officials. The atmosphere was tense with an undercurrent of barely controlled panic. "Captain Hartwell," the king began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You've been closest to Prince George during this period. Did you have any indication that he was planning such a drastic action?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "Your Majesty, the prince has always been thoughtful about social issues and the role of the monarchy. Over recent months, his concerns about inequality and social responsibility have deepened. But I did not anticipate this specific decision." The queen leaned forward, her eyes red from crying. "Could you not have guided him away from these thoughts? Helped him understand that he can create change from within the system?" The question pierced Thomas's heart. He had asked himself the same thing dozens of times since the morning's revelation. "Your Majesty, I believe I may have inadvertently encouraged his thinking by sharing stories about ordinary people's lives and struggles. If I failed in my duty to redirect his concerns, I take full responsibility." One of the senior advisors interrupted. "The question now is not who is to blame, but how we manage this crisis. The prince's decision will have enormous implications for the monarchy's stability and public perception." Thomas listened as various scenarios were discussed. Some suggested attempting to convince Prince George to delay his decision, to take time to reconsider. Others proposed managing the public announcement, to minimize damage to the royal family's reputation. A few even suggested ways to legally prevent the prince from renouncing his titles. Throughout the discussion, Thomas felt increasingly uncomfortable. These people were talking about Prince George as if he were a problem to be solved, rather than a young man making a principled decision about his own life. The gap between the prince's genuine concern for others and the palace's focus on institutional preservation became painfully clear. "Captain Hartwell," the king said suddenly, "we need you to speak with Prince George. You have influence with him. Perhaps you can help him understand the broader implications of his choice." Thomas felt trapped. He could see the hope in the royal family's eyes, their belief that he might be able to change the prince's mind. But he also remembered the conviction in George's voice, the careful thought that had gone into this decision, and the genuine desire to serve others that motivated it. "Your Majesty," Thomas replied slowly, "I will speak with the prince, but I must be honest. His decision appears to be final, and it comes from a place of deep conviction about how he can best serve his country." The room fell silent. Thomas realized he had just failed to provide the reassurance the royal family desperately wanted to hear. Instead, he had confirmed their worst fears about the prince's determination. After the meeting, Thomas returned to his quarters feeling more conflicted than ever. He sat on his bed, still wearing his formal uniform, and tried to understand his own feelings about the situation. Part of him admired Prince George's courage and conviction. The prince was willing to sacrifice everything he had been born to inherit in order to serve others in a way he believed was more meaningful. But another part of Thomas felt betrayed and lost. He had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the royal family and preserving the institution of monarchy. If Prince George rejected everything Thomas had fought to defend, what did that say about the value of his service? Thomas walked to his window and looked out at the palace grounds. He remembered all the times he had walked these paths with young Prince George, answering the boy's endless questions about the world beyond the palace walls. Had those conversations planted the seeds of today's decision? Had he, in trying to help the prince understand the real world, actually contributed to this moment of crisis? The captain thought about his own family, his modest upbringing, and the pride he had felt when he first joined the Royal Guard. His parents had been so proud to see their son in service to the crown. But now he wondered if Prince George's decision actually honored the values his parents had taught him about service, sacrifice, and putting others before yourself. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. A young aide informed him that Prince George had requested another private meeting that evening. Thomas's heart sank, knowing that this conversation would likely be even more difficult than the morning's revelation. As he prepared for the meeting, Thomas realized that he was facing the most important decision of his own career. Should he try to convince Prince George to reconsider, honoring his duty to the royal family and the institution he served? Or should he support the prince's decision, recognizing the genuine good intentions behind it, even if it meant the end of everything he had dedicated his life to protecting? The weight of 23 years of service pressed down on Thomas's shoulders as he prepared to face Prince George once again. Whatever happened in their next conversation would determine not just the prince's future, but Thomas's own understanding of duty, loyalty, and what it truly means to serve others. Thomas looked at himself in the mirror, straightening his uniform one more time. The man looking back at him appeared older than he had that morning, aged by the weight of impossible choices and conflicting loyalties. In a few hours he would have to decide where his ultimate allegiance lay, with the institution he had served faithfully for decades, or with the young man whose moral conviction was about to change everything. The evening meeting took place in Prince George's private study, a room that had witnessed countless conversations between the young royal and his devoted guard over the years. Thomas entered to find the prince packing books into simple cardboard boxes, carefully wrapping items that held personal significance. "You're really doing this," Thomas said, not as a question but as a statement of acceptance. Prince George looked up from his packing, his face showing both sadness and determination. "Yes, Thomas. Tomorrow morning I'll sign the final documents. By noon I'll no longer be Prince George. I'll simply be George Windsor, a private citizen." Thomas watched as the prince carefully wrapped a small photograph of them together from a charity visit to a children's hospital. The sight of that precious memory being packed away like any ordinary possession made the reality of the situation hit him even harder. The king asked me to try to change your mind, Thomas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. George stopped packing and looked directly at his longtime protector. And what did you tell him? I told him that your decision comes from deep conviction. But Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. The prince sat down, giving Thomas his full attention. Ask me anything. Do you really believe this is the right choice, or are you running away from the responsibility that comes with your position? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas had wondered about this himself, whether the prince's decision was truly noble or simply an escape from the pressures of royal life. George considered the question carefully before answering. I've asked myself that same question hundreds of times, Thomas. If I were simply running away, there would be easier paths. I could fulfill my royal duties minimally, enjoy the privileges, and live a comfortable life without ever really engaging with the world's problems. The prince stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a worn journal. I've been keeping track of every official engagement, every ceremony, every ribbon cutting I've attended in the past 2 years. Do you know what I discovered? In all that time, with all those appearances, I helped raise approximately £2 million for various charities. Thomas nodded, remembering many of those events. But do you know what the palace spent on my security? Transportation, clothing, and support staff for those same appearances, nearly £4 million. George's voice carried a tone of frustration. We spent twice as much money on the process of raising money as we actually raised. How is that serving anyone? The mathematics of the situation struck Thomas like a physical blow. He had never considered the cost-benefit analysis of royal charitable work. But surely there are other benefits, Thomas argued. Your presence brings attention to important causes. You inspire people to get involved. That's what I told myself too, George replied. But then I started visiting the same communities months after our official visits. The media attention lasted a week. The funding we helped raise was often tied up in administrative costs and bureaucracy for months. Meanwhile, the same families were still struggling with the same problems. George opened his journal and showed Thomas pages of handwritten notes from unofficial visits to various organizations. When I visit these places as just George without cameras or ceremony, I can actually sit with people, understand their real needs, and figure out practical solutions. I can volunteer directly, work alongside them, and make immediate impacts on individual lives. Thomas read through some of the entries, seeing detailed accounts of time spent serving meals at homeless shelters, tutoring children at community centers, and helping elderly residents with home repairs. These were activities Prince George had done quietly, without any official recognition or media coverage. Last month, I spent 3 days helping repair a community center that serves 200 families. George continued. The total cost of materials was £800. Compare that to the £10,000 spent on security and logistics for a single official visit to cut a ribbon at a new building. The logical argument was compelling, but Thomas still struggled with the emotional impact. George, you're talking about efficiency and direct service, but what about hope? What about the inspiration you provide to people just by being who you are? The prince smiled sadly. I want to inspire people, Thomas, but I want to inspire them with my actions, not my title. I want children to say, I want to help people like George does, not, I wish I could be born into royalty like Prince George. Thomas felt his resistance beginning to crumble. The prince's reasoning was sound, his motivations pure, and his commitment undeniable. But accepting the logic meant accepting that everything Thomas had dedicated his life to might have been misguided. What about me? Thomas asked, surprising himself with the vulnerability in his voice. What am I supposed to do when the person I've sworn to protect no longer exists? George's expression softened with genuine compassion. Thomas, you've protected me in ways that go far beyond physical security. You've helped shape my character, guided my thinking, and shown me what real integrity looks like. You've already succeeded in your most important duty. The prince reached into his desk and pulled out an official-looking document. I've spoken with your superiors about your future. You have several options. You can remain with the Royal Guard and be assigned to protect another family member. You can accept a promotion to train new guards, or... George paused, looking uncertain for the first time that evening. Or what? Thomas prompted. There's a position available running security for a major humanitarian organization. The pay is less than your current salary, but the work involves protecting aid workers in dangerous areas, coordinating security for refugee camps, and ensuring the safety of people doing exactly the kind of work I want to do. Thomas stared at the document George was offering him. It represented a complete departure from everything he had known, a chance to apply his skills in service of the very causes that motivated Prince George's decision. "You researched this for me?" Thomas asked. "You've spent 23 years protecting me. The least I could do was think about your future, too." George's voice was thick with emotion. "But Thomas, whatever you choose, I need you to know that serving the royal family wasn't a waste of your time. You helped create the person who's making this decision today. Your influence made me better, and that matters." Thomas took the document with trembling hands, scanning the details of the humanitarian security position. It would mean leaving everything familiar, starting over in a completely different world, using his skills to protect people who were actively trying to make the world better. "Why are you showing me this?" Thomas asked. "Because I hope that maybe someday we can work together again, not as prince and guard, but as two people committed to serving others." George's eyes showed hope mixed with uncertainty. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know this decision affects your life too." Thomas looked around the study one more time, seeing the empty shelves and packed boxes that represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The young man he had helped raise was asking him to trust in a vision of service that went beyond tradition and protocol. The morning of Prince George's formal renunciation dawned gray and misty, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood within the palace walls. Thomas had spent the entire night walking the palace grounds, unable to sleep as he wrestled with the most difficult decision of his life. By 6 in the morning, Thomas found himself standing outside Prince George's chambers, knowing this would be one of their final conversations while George still held his royal title. He knocked gently, and the prince's voice called for him to enter. George was already dressed in a simple dark suit, looking more like a university student than a member of the royal family. On his desk lay the signed documents that would change his life forever, along with a small pile of royal insignia and ceremonial items he was returning to the crown. "I didn't think you'd be awake this early," Thomas said, noting the prince's calm demeanor. "I couldn't sleep either," George admitted. "Too much excitement about what comes next, I suppose." Thomas noticed that the prince seemed lighter somehow, as if a tremendous weight had already been lifted from his shoulders. There was an energy about him that Thomas hadn't seen in months, a sense of purpose and anticipation that confirmed the rightness of his decision. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" George asked, referring to the humanitarian security position they had discussed the night before. Thomas pulled the application papers from his jacket pocket. They were filled out and signed, ready to be submitted. "I've made my choice," he said quietly. George's eyes widened with hope and surprise. "Really? 23 years ago I swore an oath to protect and serve. I thought that meant protecting one person and serving one institution. But you've taught me that the real meaning goes deeper than that." Thomas's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I want to protect people who are making a difference in the world. I want to serve causes that actually help others." The smile that spread across George's face was brighter than any Thomas had seen during their years together. "Thomas, are you absolutely sure? You'd be giving up security, prestige, everything you've built here." "You're giving up much more than I am," Thomas replied. "If you can sacrifice a crown for your principles, I can certainly sacrifice a comfortable position for mine." George stood and embraced Thomas, something that would have been unthinkable under normal protocol. But everything about this day was beyond normal protocol. "We're both going to be starting over," the prince said. "It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Thomas felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized this embrace was not between a prince and his guard, but between two friends who had chosen to follow their consciences into an uncertain future. At 10 o'clock, the formal ceremony took place in the palace's smaller ceremonial room. Only immediate family members and essential legal witnesses were present. Thomas stood at his usual position, maintaining his professional composure, despite the emotional turmoil inside. The constitutional lawyer read through the legal requirements as Prince George formally renounced his place in the line of succession, surrendered his royal titles, and relinquished his claim to any crown properties or privileges. The prince's signature was steady and confident as he signed each document. When the lawyer announced that the renunciation was complete and legally binding, The room fell into profound silence. George Windsor, no longer Prince George, turned to face his family. His mother was crying openly, while his father maintained the stoic expression that had been trained into him from childhood. "I love you all," George said simply. "This doesn't change that. I hope someday you'll understand that I'm doing this because of the values you taught me, not in spite of them." The king stepped forward and embraced his son, whispering something in his ear that made George nod solemnly. The queen followed, holding her son for a long moment before stepping back and composing herself. Then George turned to Thomas. In front of the assembled witnesses, he extended his hand formally. "Captain Hartwell, thank you for your years of faithful service to the crown and to my family." Thomas shook the offered hand, understanding this was the official end of their professional relationship. "It has been my honor, your—" He paused, realizing the title no longer applied. "It has been my honor, Mr. Windsor." But George didn't release Thomas's hand. "Thomas, I have one final request. As George Windsor, private citizen, I'd like to ask if you'd consider being my friend." The formal ceremony dissolved into something much more personal. Thomas found himself smiling through his tears as he replied, "I'd be honored, George. I'd be honored." After the ceremony, Thomas accompanied George to his car for the last time in his official capacity. George's belongings filled the modest vehicle, a sharp contrast to the royal limousines and elaborate processions that had characterized his life until that moment. "Where will you go first?" Thomas asked. "I've enrolled in university starting next month. Until then, I'm going to volunteer at the community center where I spent time last year. They've offered me a place to stay in their staff housing." George's excitement was evident in his voice. Real work, real purpose, real life. Thomas watched as George loaded the last of his boxes into the car. "When do you start your new position?" George asked. "Next week. Training begins in London. Then my first assignment is coordinating security for aid distribution in refugee camps." Thomas felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation about his own new beginning. "We'll both be learning how to live in the real world," George observed. As George prepared to drive away from the palace for the last time as a resident, he rolled down his window for one final exchange. "Thomas, thank you for showing me what real service looks like. You helped me become the person who could make this choice." Thomas stepped back as the car pulled away, watching until it disappeared beyond the palace gates. He stood there for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. The prince he had sworn to protect was gone, but the young man he had helped raise was just beginning his real journey. Other guards and staff members began approaching Thomas, offering condolences as if someone had died. But Thomas didn't feel like mourning. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. That evening, Thomas submitted his resignation from the Royal Guard and his application for the humanitarian security position. As he removed his ceremonial uniform for the last time, he reflected on how George's courage had given him the strength to make his own difficult choice. The boy he had once protected had grown into a man who was now inspiring others to be brave. Thomas realized that in many ways, his greatest success as a royal guard wasn't preventing danger from reaching Prince George, but helping George develop the character and conviction to choose his own path, even when that path led away from everything Thomas had sworn to protect. 6 months after George Windsor's dramatic decision to leave royal life behind, Thomas found himself in a refugee camp on the border between two war-torn countries. His new role as security coordinator for humanitarian operations had taken him far from the manicured gardens and formal ceremonies of palace life. But he had never felt more purposeful. The work was demanding and often dangerous. Thomas was responsible for ensuring the safety of aid workers, coordinating with local authorities, and managing security protocols for food distribution and medical services. Every day brought new challenges, from negotiating with hostile local militias to evacuating workers from areas that had become too dangerous. Despite the hardships, Thomas woke each morning with a sense of energy and purpose that had been missing during his final years at the palace. He was using his skills to protect people who were risking their lives to help the most vulnerable populations in the world. The contrast between his current work and his former ceremonial duties couldn't have been more stark. One evening, as Thomas finished reviewing security reports in his makeshift office, he received an unexpected message on his satellite phone. It was from George, who had been maintaining minimal contact since they had both started their new lives. Thomas, I hope this message finds you safe and well. I wanted you to know that I've just completed my first semester at university. The social work program is everything I hoped it would be. But more importantly, I wanted to share some news that I think will make you proud. Thomas smiled, remembering the eager young man who had been so excited about starting university and living like an ordinary student. The message continued. I've been accepted for a summer internship with the same humanitarian organization where you're working. They don't know about our connection, and I haven't mentioned my background. I'm just George Windsor, a university student who wants to gain experience in international aid work. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. The possibility of working alongside George again, this time as equals pursuing the same mission, filled him with unexpected joy. The internship is in a different region from where you're stationed, but there's a chance our paths might cross during training or coordination meetings. I wanted you to know in case we encounter each other, so you wouldn't be shocked to see me in a humanitarian aid camp instead of a palace. The message ended with a warmth that reminded Thomas of their best conversations. I think about you often, and I hope you're finding the same sense of purpose in this work that I'm discovering in my studies. Thank you for showing me that real courage means choosing what's right over what's comfortable. Thomas read the message 3 times, feeling a mixture of pride, excitement, and concern for George's safety. The young man who had given up a life of luxury and security was now preparing to enter some of the most dangerous places on earth, driven by the same desire to serve others that had led him to renounce his royal status. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself thinking frequently about George's upcoming internship. He reached out to colleagues in other regions, discreetly inquiring about a new intern named George Windsor, without revealing their connection. The reports he received were consistently positive. George was described as hardworking, dedicated, and remarkably mature for his age. 1 month later, Thomas received notification that he would be attending a regional coordination meeting at the organization's field headquarters. As he reviewed the attendee list, his heart jumped when he saw G. Windsor intern among the participants. The meeting was scheduled to last 3 days, bringing together security coordinators, program managers, and field workers from across several countries. Thomas arrived at the compound to find it bustling with activity, as teams from various regions gathered to share experiences and coordinate future operations. On the first morning of the conference, Thomas was reviewing security protocols with other coordinators when he heard a familiar voice asking questions about refugee camp management. He turned to see George, dressed in simple field clothes, actively participating in a discussion about water sanitation systems. George looked different from the young man who had left the palace 6 months earlier. He was leaner, more weathered, with the kind of tan that comes from working outdoors in challenging conditions. But more than his physical appearance, there was something different about his presence. He carried himself with quiet confidence, speaking knowledgeably about practical humanitarian challenges. When George noticed Thomas across the room, his face lit up with genuine joy, but he maintained his professional composure. During a break in the sessions, they found a quiet moment to speak privately. "Thomas," George said, embracing his former protector warmly, "it's so good to see you. You look well, though I can see this work is challenging you." Thomas studied, George's face noting the maturity and confidence that had developed during their months apart. "You look like you found your place in the world," Thomas observed. "I have," George replied without hesitation. "Every day is difficult, but every day matters. I wake up knowing that my work directly impacts people's lives. There's no ceremony, no protocol, just real problems that need real solutions." George described his experiences working in refugee camps, helping with everything from setting up temporary shelters to organizing educational programs for displaced children. His eyes shone with enthusiasm as he talked about the families he had met and the small victories he had witnessed. "The best part," George continued, "is that nobody knows who I used to be. They judge me based on my work, my attitude, and my willingness to help. I'm earning respect the same way everyone else does, through actions rather than birth." Thomas felt immense pride listening to George describe his new life. The decision to leave royal life behind had clearly been the right choice. George had found authentic purpose and was making a real difference in the world. "What about you?" George asked. "Are you happy with your choice?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "It's been the most challenging and rewarding work of my life. I'm protecting people who are genuinely making the world better. Every security measure I implement, every risk I help them avoid, means they can continue their vital work." During the 3-day conference, Thomas and George maintained professional boundaries while working together on various sessions. Thomas watched with amazement as George contributed meaningfully to complex discussions about aid distribution, security protocols, and community engagement strategies. On the final evening, they shared a simple meal together outside the compound, looking up at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than any they had seen from the palace grounds. "Do you ever regret your decision?" Thomas asked. George was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Not for a single day. I miss my family, and I worry about how my choice affected them. But I've never been more certain that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing with my life." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. His own journey from palace guard to humanitarian security coordinator had taught him that real satisfaction comes from aligning your actions with your deepest values, regardless of external rewards or recognition. 2 years had passed since Thomas's emotional final day as a royal guard, and he found himself standing in a small village clinic in a remote mountain region, watching George bandage the injured hand of an elderly farmer. The former prince worked with gentle efficiency, speaking softly in the local language he had learned during his months of service in the area. The transformation in both men was remarkable. Thomas had developed into one of the organization's most respected security coordinators, known for his ability to work effectively with local communities and his deep understanding of the complex challenges facing humanitarian workers. His experience protecting the royal family had translated surprisingly well to protecting aid workers, though the stakes felt more meaningful now. George had evolved from an eager intern into a seasoned field worker. After completing his university degree in social work, he had taken a permanent position with the humanitarian organization. His official title was Community Development Coordinator, but his colleagues simply knew him as someone who could be counted on to tackle the most difficult challenges with patience and determination. Neither man had returned to England since, leaving their former lives behind. Thomas had received occasional updates about the royal family through news reports, noting that they had adapted to George's absence and continued their duties with characteristic resilience. The palace had officially announced that Prince George was pursuing private humanitarian work, without revealing the full extent of his decision to renounce his titles. On this particular day, Thomas and George were working together to establish a new health clinic in a village that had been cut off from medical services for over a decade due to ongoing regional conflicts. Thomas was responsible for assessing security risks and developing safety protocols, while George focused on training local residents to operate and maintain the clinic independently. As evening approached, they sat together outside the clinic, reviewing the day's progress and planning the next phase of the project. The easy camaraderie between them had evolved far beyond their original guard-and-prince relationship into a deep friendship between equals who shared common purpose and values. "Remember, when you used to worry about me walking through palace gardens without proper security coverage?" George asked with a smile, gesturing toward the mountain paths where he now traveled regularly with minimal protection. Thomas laughed, thinking about how his definition of acceptable risk had completely changed. "I spent years worried about photographers getting too close to you. Now I worry about armed militias and natural disasters. It's funny how perspective changes everything." They were interrupted by a young village girl who approached shyly, carrying a small handmade gift for George. She had been one of his first students in the literacy program he had established months earlier. In halting English, she thanked him for teaching her to read and write. Thomas watched this interaction with deep satisfaction. This was the kind of direct personal impact that George had dreamed about during their conversations in the palace library. No ceremonies, no media coverage, no formal protocols. Just one person helping another learn skills that would change her life forever. As the girl ran back to her family, George turned to Thomas with tears in his eyes. "Do you remember that night in my study when I tried to explain why I needed to leave? I couldn't quite put into words what I was hoping to find." Thomas nodded, remembering the anguish in George's voice as he struggled to articulate his vision for a different kind of service. "This is what I was looking for," George continued, gesturing toward the clinic, the village, and the mountains beyond. "Real relationships, direct impact, work that matters immediately to the people it's supposed to help." Thomas felt his own eyes becoming moist as he realized how completely George's vision had been fulfilled. "You found what you were looking for," he said simply. "We both did," George corrected. "You could have tried to talk me out of leaving. You could have chosen to stay in your comfortable position at the palace. Instead, you took your own leap of faith." That evening, as they prepared for bed in the simple guest quarters provided by the village, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this remote mountain community. The luxury and security of palace life seemed like memories from someone else's existence. Thomas pulled out a worn letter he had received from his replacement at the palace several months earlier. The new captain had written to update him on changes in royal security protocols and to express admiration for Thomas's courage in pursuing humanitarian work. The letter mentioned that the royal family occasionally asked about both Thomas and George, always with affection and respect for their choices. "I got another letter from the palace," Thomas told George, sharing the contents of the message. George listened thoughtfully before responding. "I miss them terribly sometimes, but I also know that we're all exactly where we're supposed to be. They're serving the country in their way, and we're serving the world in ours." The next morning brought news that would test everything they had built together. Thomas received an urgent message that security conditions in the region were deteriorating rapidly, and all international aid workers were being evacuated immediately. The clinic project would have to be suspended, and the progress they had made over months of work might be lost. As they prepared for evacuation, Thomas watched George struggle with the decision of whether to leave with the other international workers or find a way to remain and continue the work. The village residents pleaded with George to stay, expressing their fear that without his presence, the clinic would be abandoned and their children's education program would end. Thomas found himself in a familiar position, tasked with protecting George from danger, but now the dynamics were completely different. George was no longer someone whose safety was guaranteed by birthright and protocol. He was a humanitarian worker who had to make his own decisions about acceptable risk. "If you decide to stay, I'll stay with you," Thomas told George quietly. "But I need you to understand the real dangers we'd be facing." George looked around the village one more time, seeing the faces of people who had become friends rather than subjects. After long consideration, he made his decision. "We can't abandon them. We'll stay, but we'll be smart about it. We'll work with local contacts, maintain low profiles, and be ready to leave quickly if conditions worsen." Thomas nodded, respecting George's choice while already beginning to calculate the security measures they would need to implement. They were no longer bound by royal protocol or institutional requirements. They were simply two people committed to finishing what they had started, regardless of the personal cost. As the evacuation vehicles departed, leaving Thomas and George alone with their local colleagues, Thomas realized that this moment represented the complete fulfillment of the transformation that had begun 2 years earlier in a palace library. They had become exactly what George had envisioned, people whose service was defined by their choices rather than their circumstances, whose protection of others came from love rather than duty, and whose courage emerged from conviction rather than obligation. Standing together in that remote mountain village, watching the sun set over peaks that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and resilience, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion. The tears that had marked his final day as a royal guard had been tears of ending, but if tears came now, they would be tears of fulfillment, recognizing that sometimes the most difficult decisions lead to the most meaningful destinations.